I grew up involved in scouting and left around the age of 15. I've recently become involved again as a leader, and I had forgotten about my experiences camping in rural Australia until revisiting a campsite and reminiscing on some scary stories. I figured I would share it here and potentially get some insight on what this may have been. I was about 13 or 14 at the time and had gone on a camping trip with my troop. We went to a campsite we stayed at often, as it was only around 30 minutes away from our city. It was large and open to account for many scouts, as it acted as a hub for my state's combined activities that all groups would attend, but this particular camp was only for our group, which consisted of 10 to 12 people. We set up camp in a back corner of the campsite, which was backed by a fence and thick trees, leading to a cliff overlooking a river if you walked far enough. We arrived around 6 p.m, set up camp, and basically went straight to bed. It's fairly consistent in my area that asking 11 to 15-year-olds to set up camp takes far longer than it should, and we were pretty tired. In the centre of the campsite was a large toilet block surrounded by rocks and separated into 4 sections: male and female, adult and youth. Our campsite was probably about 300 or so metres from this block. The first 2 nights went without incident, but it was our 3rd night that something occurred that left myself and 2 others with a sleepless night and an apprehension to camping there again. It was 3 to a tent, and we all hopped into our sleeping bags for our last night before heading home. The others in the tent, we'll call them Olivia and Jess, dozed off fairly quickly, but it took me a little longer. I've always struggled to fall asleep and stay asleep, so when I seemingly randomly woke not long after dozing off, it wasn't a huge shock. Nothing seemed amiss at first, so I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep once again. It only took a few seconds for me to hear footsteps walking towards the toilet block. We were camped on an area of lush green grass that scrunched under your feet, and the sound of someone walking was distinct in the quiet night. I thought it was strange I hadn't heard a tent zipper, but brushed it off. A few minutes later I heard them approaching, still a normal course of events, until the footsteps stopped outside our tent. I looked over and both Olivia and Jess were sound asleep, so I knew it wasn't one of them. I waited a few seconds and they continued moving, so again I figured it was strange but brushed it off. It then sounded as though the footsteps looped around the group of tents and back to ours, the other side this time. The tents were set up in a line with a fair amount of distance between to account for guy ropes as wind had been forecast. But on this night the wind was almost non-existent. The person, or thing, had seemed to walk around the whole line to stop back at ours again, which was the second closest to the toilet block in the line of 4. I then heard them walk towards the tree line. I sat up, trying to listen as closely as I could now. At this point, I was sure it wasn't one of us. The behaviour of the footsteps was too strange, and why on earth had they sounded like they were walking into the trees? I think it was close to 2 a.m. at this point, and I had had enough of being alone experiencing this, and gently shook Olivia awake, shushing her as she stirred. Olivia was my closest friend in the group, and I whispered a quick explanation of what I had heard to her. We agreed to wait a while and see if anything else happened. Quite a few minutes passed, I don't remember how many, and the weirdness of the situation had started to wear off, and I was about to suggest trying to fall back asleep when the footsteps seemed to return from where they had left and again stop behind our tent. Olivia and I shared a look in the dim light the moon was casting in the tent, and I could tell she was as unsettled as I was. We heard them begin to slowly circle the tent, and she silently moved to huddle next to me. Bit by bit, the footsteps began to quicken until they seemed to break into a run. Whoever, or whatever it was, had to expertly dodge our guy ropes to move at that speed without tripping. Every now and then something would brush the sides of the tent as Olivia and I were holding each other, doing our best not to make a noise. It was at this point that Jess woke up and groggily asked, "What the hell is going on?" She looked over to us, tears forming in our eyes, and shot up, terror crossing her face. she silently moved over to join us in our terror-filled huddle. Her question did not seem to faze whatever was making the noise. The sprinting went on for what felt like ages, but in reality it was probably only a minute or so until they stopped in front of our tent again. I slowly reached for a spare tent peg and gripped it as tight as I could, thinking that in a pinch it would do as some kind of weapon. The footsteps slowly did their wrap around the tents again before stopping behind ours and then retreating back to the tree line. With some insane burst of courage and morbid curiosity, I decided to take a look outside. Still gripping my tent peg, I slowly unzipped our tent, trying to be as soundless as possible. The fly unzipped from the bottom, so I laid down and peeked underneath, rather than unzip it and then potentially create more noise. The footsteps had seemed to stop shortly after their retreat, and there were no further noises. This would mean that the person would have had to get over a wire fence without a sound, which didn't seem plausible, but I saw absolutely nothing. Needless to say, the three of us didn't get any more sleep that night. When recounting this story to our leaders that morning, we were told we had probably heard a possum or some other animal, an explanation I simply do not buy. None of the other campers had heard anything. Some of the strangest parts of this experience to me are that there were no other sounds other than the footsteps and the occasional brushing of the tent, no heavy breathing or any spoken words or even animal noises. The person or thing seemed to disappear when I went to look, and the targeted and odd nature of the behaviour. Why was our tent targeted? Had something been looking for a target and when I awoke it chose us? Why did it just leave after scaring the ever-living daylights out of a group of teen girls? Why hadn't anyone else heard anything? Our tents were decently spaced apart for the guy ropes, so it's plausible that the noise was harder to hear for the other campers and maybe not enough to wake them, but the sound seemed fairly loud to us. If anyone has ever had a similar experience or has any idea what could have happened, I would love to hear about it. This isn't the only experience I've had while camping, and not the only one at this campsite, but certainly the only one of this magnitude. We were driving from the Darling Downs to Darwin just after Christmas. We were moving, so we had the cat with us and had prepared for the possibility of having to camp. We had two interesting experiences. The one night that we camped, we pulled off the highway in Channel Country, somewhere north of Winton. There was a cattle truck, a large rocky hill, and a dry creek. The most exciting bit of landscape we had seen all day. We set up camp late in the afternoon as the day finally cooled off and settled down for the evening. There was a decent sunset and some cows rambled past, content to ignore us. Pro tip to those wondering, cats bloody hate camping. The poor thing only settled when we put her in her carrier in the car. Anyway, later that night as I'm dozing off, I hear a gunshot, and knowing our nation's proud history of offing interlopers in the outback, it had my attention. Now I can't really call myself a country lass, but I knew my fair share of them, and that gunshot did not show up all alone. It was quickly accompanied by the blaring of country music, more gunshots, and the rev of an engine. I'm going to guess a ute decked out for pigging, but honestly, I did not stick my head out to check. This righteous evening was getting a little bit too close to our camp, and I decided my husband, being unfazed apparently by the sound of gunshots, needed to be woken up. Now, at this point, there was probably no real reason for alarm. A bunch of young people blowing off steam, taking potshots at the landscape, good to keep tabs on them, but they were no B.J. Murdoch. Then they stopped at the end of our little cattle track, lights blazing, and started to dig. No more music, no more gunshots, just the dull scrape and thud as a shovel hit dry, dusty soil again and again. They must have stayed there digging for at least 15 minutes. It felt like forever. And every part of me screamed, be ready to run. My husband set up out of sight behind the trailer as I grabbed my keys and wallet with a mental note that I was prepared to leave everything else in the camp behind. In due course, they moved on, finished digging, and disappeared into the featureless plains. The distance travelled measured by the ever-diminishing sounds of gunfire. I did not sleep that night, and as soon as the sun was up, we packed up and hit the road. Now, I know rationally that there was probably nothing sinister to the digging. They likely got bogged in the chalky dust, an easy enough thing to do. And my husband had been so calm. Yeah, he had kept an eye on them, but then he went back to sleep once they had left. I thought maybe I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. But you know, man, the vibe. The vibe was all sorts of wrong. So I felt somewhat vindicated when the next day, heading to Mount Isa, my husband stated, "I was really worried last night. Neither of us checked the earth at the end of the cattle track." The other one was the same trip. We joked about Devonshire tea and murder as we were moved on by police in Larimer. Check out Last Stop Larimer on Netflix for that one. Let's just say we turned up on the day they were searching the septic tank. When I was young, I lived in quite a small town in Queensland. The whole town was surrounded by bush in every direction for hundreds of kilometres. We had so much room to play. This particular story is about the first time that we got drunk. In the winter, the level of water would drop significantly, enough for us to camp in the riverbed. My best mate's parents owned a pub at the time, so we were in charge of getting the drinks for a little camping trip we had planned, so we could finally pop our drunk cherry. The place that we had in mind was out near an old Indigenous settlement. We made our way down into the riverbank, which was low on the side that we came in and really high on the other side. You couldn't see on the other side through all of the trees on the top, and it was kind of unnerving knowing that somebody could be up there watching and you wouldn't even know. There were about 7 of us kids in the camp, and our parents had no idea where we were or what we were doing. We all lied and said that we were staying at a friend's place. We set up our camp and built a little shelter for all of us to sleep under. When we were all set up, we started drinking as the sun was setting. Soon it was dark and we were in full swing, mixing drinks and singing songs and throwing stuff in the water and generally making a whole heap of noise. As we were starting to wind down, one of my friends said that he saw something move at the top of the riverbed on the steep side. We all said that he was full of shit and should calm down, but he was adamant that there was someone up there, so we all started calling out, "Come out, you pussy," and other such things, being brave well beyond our years. To our surprise, a bearded man wearing straggly clothes and no shoes came out of the tree line, stood on the edge of the bank and just stared at us. We all went silent, waiting for him to do something, but for about 5 minutes he just stood there, and then he retreated back into the tree line. We all talked amongst ourselves and got a bit nervous, but we soon forgot about it. About an hour later the guy was back, but he wasn't on the bank anymore. He came out of the shadows from the other side of the bank and entered our camp. He came over and stood next to the fire, just joined our group of 12-year-old kids and just stood there. We were all officially a bit scared and didn't really know what to do, so we just sat there in silence. Eventually, one of my friends got up the courage to speak to him. "G'day, mate. How are ya? Are you okay?" The guy just stared at my friend and then stared at each of us in turn, a little bit of time spent on each of us. My friend tried again. "Hey, you okay? What's your name?" The man snapped his head back at my friend and stared at him wide-eyed for at least 2 minutes before answering. Without blinking, he said in a raspy whisper, "That's none of your fucking business." And he hissed like a cat. Then this guy just jumped back screaming and staring at the fire like it had just appeared and ran off up the steep bank in record time. It was impossible to get up this thing, so we all just stood there speechless. We decided that it was best if we just stoked the fire up because it was about a 19-kilometre walk in the pitch black back to town, and we weren't confident on that. So stoke the fire we did. We sat up for as long as we could, keeping watch, not really talking. We all eventually dozed off one by one. When we woke up in the morning, everything was gone. All of our alcohol, all of our bags, all of our shoes, and all of our blankets. Everything. The creepy thing was that none of us awoke as someone robbed us blind, and there was not a single footprint. We were sleeping in wettish sand, so there should have been footprints everywhere, but there were none. It looked like we hadn't even been there. Needless to say, we bailed and ran most of the way back to town. Our feet were all cut up and messy by the time we got back. We never told our parents about our camping trip, and I don't think that we ever will.